Hi, I'm Jack, and I'm a member of the Youth Advisory Council for Orygen. Uh,
And I'm Simon Rice. I work in the Young Men's Mental Health Research Team at Orygen, and have had a really long-standing interest, both research-wise and in terms of clinical practice and the services that we offer. Interest in supporting young men's mental health.
awesome. I think, as you've seen the talking points, I think we're really keen to just have a conversation, ask some kind of really interesting questions about men's mental health. I think one of the first things that I was probably really curious about is that the suicide data of young men's a lot higher than the presentation of suicide in young men. And I was wondering why that is, and yeah, why do men kind of present less, like kind of end up in that end result a little bit more?
Yeah, there's some really complex questions there, Jack, and lots of things for us to tease apart. Worldwide, the suicide rates, when we look at gender comparisons, crude male-female comparisons, tend to be much, much higher in males. There are discrepancies between various countries, and there's been some really interesting work going on around how gender norms contribute to that and may place males and females at differential risk of suicide outcomes. But when we think of Western nations, there are particular codes and norms in relation to gender that we think are really powerful influences of suicide-related outcomes. And even thinking more upstream than that, not just suicide, but accessing care for mental health problems, and often accessing care for any kind of health-related problem, which can powerfully influence men's engagement. And those norms are often around what we call stoicism, men feeling like they need to manage problems independently and on their own and without needing to access help or support from others, a sense of invulnerability, and a worry that they'll be perceived as being less manly, less dominant in a hierarchy. And these are often called traditional notions of masculinity, or sometimes dominant or hegemonic notions of masculinity. And it doesn't mean that everyone subscribes to them. And I think we all acknowledge that many of these norms are changing and are being challenged a lot, especially in the current era that we're living in now. But I think there's still a lag effect where they do have some influence on men and young men. And I think often there's a lot of implicit assumptions that young men will make, that if I do X, I'll be perceived as being Y. And sometimes those assumptions are just incorrect, but that doesn't stop the individual thinking that they're correct. And I think there's some of the reasons why we do see this difference between mental health presentations being lower in men, but suicide rates being higher.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. It's something I see in the males that I surround myself with, that there is that notion of, I'm the man, I'm the caregiver, all those kind of unfair assumptions that I don't think probably apply as much in our modern world as they might have once done. And then talking about people thinking that they're weak because they have problems with mental health. I've got a beard. I play footy and play sport, and it's not something that I had needed help for my mental health, and was lucky to have a good support group around me that supported me. But I'm so unfortunate that old men don't think that, and think that, actually when you go out and talk to your friends, I actually think you find that they're a lot more supportive than sometimes you may think, which I think is really important. Just like goes back to kind of the stigma, which is really, really unfortunate.
And I think that's a really neat point, Jack, that often ways to engage young men and men can be around helping others. And some really interesting strategies and techniques are used internationally around this, so that trying to engage men who might be going through a really difficult time, reaching out to them directly might be challenging. That's not to say it's not important to do. I think it still is. But if you pose it to them that their involvement in a support group, in a therapy group, in a program, might actually help their mate and their mate needs help, they might be much more willing to help their mate get along to the group, go to the group and then realise, or the program, realise, oh, actually I could get something out of this as well, and then they're engaged. So, it's a bit of a crude example, but there are lots of ways that we could think about organising our services in slightly different ways to better engage young males and males, because we do see issues with young males in particular not seeking mental health services, not seeking help from mental health services as much as other gendered groups. And when they do, they're more likely to drop out earlier.
That's really, really interesting. Something else I was really, really curious about that I've seen in my own experience was I always felt like there was a lack of male mental health professionals for me to go to. And I was wondering if you would think that some men don't want to seek help because they're unaware that they can talk to other men, or don't feel like they have that option to speak to other men or people that they can maybe relate to a little bit more strongly.
Definitively, we don't have good data one way or the other. There are some studies or some people working in the field that have written a lot around the lack of male clinicians, the lack of a male workforce in being a real barrier. In some of the survey work that we've been doing over the last couple of years, we've put that question to men and young men. The vast majority have said they don't really care about the gender, the sex of the person that they're seeking help from. There is a group that do have a preference for male. They tend to be relatively small, around 15 to 20% in the surveys that we do. Often the group that will prefer a female therapist, clinician, workout will be greater, so maybe 30 or 40%, but the vast majority really don't mind. They just want to be able to see a competent person. But I think that the more important point is, if we were in a position where we could offer more choice to people coming to health services, regardless of their gender, I think that would be a better option, because there will be a group that do have a clear preference, and if there's an opportunity to match to their preference, that might be a powerful way in helping their engagement, at least in the early phase.
Yeah, definitely. That's really, really fascinating. I didn't know a lot of that. Thanks for saying that. It's definitely something that I think that's really interesting, seeing the amount, because I think definitely in some of the communities, I'm from a regional rural area, and I definitely think there is kind of a feeling of that. I know our Headspace Centre has I think one male clinician there, and I just think it's a really, really interesting talking point, seeing kind of who what kind of percentage of males are really interested in seeing a man. But that's really, really good stuff.
Well, I think, Jack, that also kind of links into the point around role modelling and the power that role models play and have. And, for many young men, key role models, again, this is stereotypically speaking, but key role models will be around sport, perhaps other aspects of culture, music. And if, for instance, young men are engaged with a sports club where they are seeing coaches connect with them in really meaningful and supportive ways, but also being cognizant of things like mental health, then that's probably really powerful in setting the scene around the kind of young man and man that they can then aspire to be. And whether that's thinking about things from, a mental health perspective, rather than just saying, don't worry about the pain, don't worry about the fear, it doesn't exist. Well, there might be a time and a place for that, but we've got pretty good data now showing that when men constantly suppress their emotions, it leads to longer term harm, both physical and mental health. So I think there is a balance to be struck, and this is something that in our work with elite sporting codes, we've come up against with a lot, where coaches have come to us, and how do we tread that fine line between the notion of going out to play in the high performance arena where there's an expectation that you're going to be a warrior, but when you come in at halftime, we want you to be vulnerable and let us know what's going on for you, because they're almost opposing ways of operating and being. And I think there is a way to manage that, but the way in which role models facilitate that is really, really important. And so that's one example. And I think there are lots of examples where role models are really important, whether they're clinicians, coaches or other significant people in the lives of young men.
That's really fascinating. Sorry, as someone who didn't really grow up with a father around us probably as much as I'd like, and someone who played sports, I definitely felt that attachment and trying to link onto those kind of male role models in my life. And I was probably really, really lucky that I had a lot of really positive male role models. But I know that there's a lot of people who probably don't have access to that. And going back to that kind of what you're saying about, you're playing sport, you're a warrior, you show no fear kind of stuff, I think can be quite damaging. And I've been personally really lucky to probably not experience as much of that.
Well, it's an interesting point. I think it can be quite damaging in the wrong circumstances. And the work that we're doing, the message that we're trying to get out is not that masculinity is bad and you've got to turn off your masculinity and you have to overly feminize. It's that it's really helpful to know when adhering to some of those male role norms, those masculine norms, might actually be not in your best interests in terms of health, mental health, relationships, career, longevity, whatever it is, and knowing when you might actually have a little bit of flexibility to step out of that mold and that way of being. And that's really empowering for the individual to know that. And that will lead to, much greater satisfaction, connection with others, better health outcomes. I think if young men feel like they've got the freedom and the capacity to do that more often. Often there's a perception, and sometimes it's not just a perception, it can be notions that are reinforced, that there's a fairly narrow band in which young men can operate and be flexible. And if you go beyond that, if you transgress beyond that, you'll be punished by your social group, you'll be ridiculed, you'll be shamed, you'll be embarrassed, you'll be rejected. And there are lots of experiences where young men will then internalise that. So while coming back to that earlier point, there are probably lots of instances where there are expectations that young men hold of themselves that other people might not necessarily hold of them. There are, on the flip side, instances where there is a real restriction. And so we're trying to tackle the problem from both perspectives, getting people in society more generally to be a bit more accommodating and open with the range of kind of behaviours that young men ought to feel comfortable to show, and also for them to challenge some of the own beliefs that they might be holding on to as well.
That's fascinating. I feel like, it's something we've probably seen through the generations. I know looking at my family and my grandparents, my great-grandparents, definitely seeing that kind of, I'll be fine, I'll get on with it, it's okay. But really it's not okay, and it's something that none of us should be afraid of going like, I need help. It's the smart thing to do, it's the wise thing to do.
And that's the balance check. You talking about real warrior culture, if you've got men going into war, you want them to be stoic, you want them to be brave, you want them to show extreme courage and to minimise, their sense of fear and any risk that they might be facing. That's really critical. Or if someone's running into a burning building because it's about to burn down and is going to rescue someone. Or our emergency service personnel in particular circumstances. Those are really important traits, and they're not just necessarily male or masculine traits. But the important point around having the flexibility of knowing when you can switch off some of those areas, I think, is really important.
Yeah, that's really interesting, saying that, neither of them are mutually exclusive and they can both work together in a really, really harmonious way of just kind of, being aware that being male or having those masculine traits is nothing to be afraid of or nothing to be ashamed of. But knowing, when to turn that off and when to go, I need help, I need to see someone, I'm not doing great. It's a really, really fine line. I think it's a really, really interesting point.
And I guess where do young men see role modelling of that kind of flexibility, that kind of breadth of human behaviour, of skills and talents and responses? Hopefully young men do get exposed to that within individuals, but I suspect that because of the way that many men feel like they need to behave, that range is narrower and it doesn't capture that wider array of kind of human experience and response and emotion. Again, coming back to that role modelling point, I think there's a real opportunity there for for greater range of experiences and behaviours and responses to be modelled.
Yeah, it makes me think of someone like Damien Hardwick. I think it's always kind of had, or the perception that I have of him is that, you know, he's a competitor when he's coaching footy, but always seemed like someone who, you know, as soon as we're off the field, we're back to being humans, and that I'm there for you, and playing that kind of father figure, which I think is just really fascinating. I think something probably that we don't see as males in the media as much as we probably should or would like to. And it's something that I know I personally found in more individual people and people that are more local to my area.
Great point, Jack. Over the weekend, I was watching the footy, and Nathan Buckley went up to one of the Collingwood players, gave him a hug before the game because he lost a family member that week. You wouldn't have seen a coach acting like that 25 years ago. Coaches didn't connect with players in those ways. So I think we're seeing the signs around really major generational shifts, and I think that's really exciting.
The change is definitely beginning, but we also need to probably be conscious that the change begins in us, and that's something that we really need to do as individuals, and something that I think I really strive to do is, you know, making sure that my male friends know that it's not a bad thing to be suffering from mental illness, and that doesn't make you, you know, any less of a man, and that seeing these people kind of in the public eye a lot more, it's just so beneficial to that view of masculinity that a lot of people have. I think, yeah, we're coming a really long way, but obviously, as I'm sure you know better than most, there's still a long way to go. But I think it's important to realize that, you know, people are doing that work. And I think that's something we can really be proud of.
And I agree, Jack. And just to close out, I think we'll know that we're there when it's not unusual, or it's not considered unusual or strange or odd or weird that a man or a young man would do that, would be able to show a greater range of emotions, that's just considered part of the human condition. I think that's when we'll know when we've got there, and we've still got a long way to go.
Absolutely. Well, Simon, thank you. Thanks so much for talking to me today. It's been absolutely fascinating. And I've learned a lot.
Great to chat, Jack.
You too.